Hello, you're on the channel Infidelity and Revenge. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can do it right now. Enjoy watching. Keel Collins stood in the long check-in queue at the airport, looking at the beautiful profile of his charming wife Heidi. She was one of those rare people whose profile was even more beautiful than the front view. He not only loved her, he adored her. It had taken him a long time to find her, but she was worth every second of the wait. He couldn't help but smile at the sight of her boyish hair, her cute button nose and her chiseled lips. "What's so funny, Keel?" Heidi asked him with a soft smile, without turning her head. "Nothing, Heidi, you're amazing," he said proudly, looking at her long, muscular legs, which were beautifully accentuated by her yoga pants. Their relationship had its ups and downs. Keel was not an easy man. He was a man of principles. Not many people could live up to his high moral standards. Heidi Martin was one such woman. She was not an easy person herself, an uncompromising vegan, a minimalist, an environmental fanatic, and a shelter volunteer. It would be fair to say that if they hadn't met each other, they would probably have been single for a very long time. They were introduced to each other 2 years ago by a mutual friend, Tracy Lee. Heidi and Tracy had worked in the legal department of a large advertising agency for the past 10 years. Tracy had been dating Keel at first. The spark between them flared up instantly, but their opposing worldviews and Keel's complete unwillingness to compromise made continuing their relationship almost impossible. In the end, however, they remained good friends. Tracy had no trouble introducing him to her best friend Heidi. They weren't a perfect couple. Keel was only a vegetarian, not a vegan. He belonged to the right camp and she to the left. He loved dogs and she loved cats. His Belgian sheepdog didn't like her ginger cat. He preferred to spend time alone with her, while she preferred socializing, hanging out and partying. Nevertheless, the commonalities between them overpowered the differences and love erupted in a flash. 10 months after their first date, they were married. In a fortnight, they will celebrate their first wedding anniversary. Heidi had given up birth control a month ago. They were ready to have children. Keel worked as a department manager for a large security company, a job arranged for him by one of his former army commanders. His service was shrouded in secrecy. Whatever he did for his country, he did it very well. He had resigned from the service at the age of 27 after suffering too many losses. Despite this, his commanders and contacts were happy to help ease his transition to civilian life. Nevertheless, he was occasionally called up into active reserve service. This usually happened 3 or 4 times a year, unexpectedly but briefly. Fortunately for him, it usually lasted only a few days. His friends and family knew not to ask any questions. Heidi's upcoming trip was related to her work and was a very happy occasion. Once a year her company took a 4-day and 3-night holiday at an all-inclusive resort, employees and spouses. In addition to 24-hour free alcohol, there were day and night parties with DJs, stand-up shows, small island tours and special attractions. The company management spared no expense. Keel was smiling adoringly at Heidi when his phone rang. His smile disappeared when he noticed the identification number on the screen. "Don't answer it!" Heidi screamed hysterically. He wrinkled his face in agony and shook his head, but held the phone to his ear. "Yes. Yes. I understand. I'm on my way." "Oh, no," Heidi whimpered. "I'm so sorry," Keel whispered honestly. "You know I have to go, but hey, have fun for both of us, okay?" Heidi nodded, clearly mortified. He gave her a quick kiss, turned and walked out of the terminal. Heidi was giving him a longing look when she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. It was Tracy's. "You and I are going to have the best time of our lives," she promised her best friend. "From now on, you're stuck with me." The flight and trip to the resort were relatively short, and check-in went smoothly. Fortunately, Tracy and her hotel roommate, April, had a room not too far from Heidi's room. Heidi's breath caught when she saw the breathtaking dark blue bay, perfectly visible from the balcony of her room. The resort's rooms were scattered in rows on the hillside that sloped down to the beach. That was where all The restaurants, bars, clubs and sports facilities were located. Fortunately for Tracy and Heidi, the rows were not high up on the hill, otherwise the climb back up the stairs would have been tedious. After a quick shower and change of clothes, Heidi met up with her friends and they went down to the dining room to have lunch. Then they skipped over to the bar. They were very excited and in high spirits when they returned to Tracy and April's room. Patrick Birch and Timmy Crofton, the young copywriters who lived in the next room, entered uninvited, with mischievous smiles. Patrick pulled out a huge joint and asked if they wanted to celebrate. The girls giggled and nodded with delight. "Where did you get that from?" Tracy asked in surprise. "The clerk who brought us our luggage asked if we needed anything else," Patrick said smugly. "It's to set the mood for the whole time here." Timmy put the mobile speaker on the coffee table and set up his phone's Bluetooth while Patrick smoked a joint. He took a deep breath and then handed it to Heidi. A melodious techno began to emanate from the speaker as Heidi exhaled. A pleasant dizziness swept over her almost immediately. A forbidden thought crossed her mind: if Keel were here with me, I wouldn't be sitting in this room with my friends enjoying fine marijuana. Keel drew the line at alcohol and was pretty strict about it. He hated feeling like he wasn't in control. "I'd like him to loosen up a bit," Heidi thought. She handed the joint to Tracy, nodding approvingly that it was a good thing. Soon they were all chattering unrestrainedly, giggling and laughing, well, almost all of them. While most people become chatty after smoking, Heidi tended to withdraw into herself. Adding alcohol to the mix only made her more quiet and withdrawn. She sank into her chair with her eyes half closed, slowly shaking her head and shoulders, enjoying the music and the pleasant massaging sensation that went all over her body. Timmy went to his room and returned with the bottles of vodka, lemon juice and disposable cups he had bought earlier at the duty-free shop. Tracy made sure Heidi got her drink in a glass. She didn't recognize any plastic. After making toasts, they began to dance slowly to the soothing music in the room. Their holiday had begun properly. Later that evening, the group of 5 sat at the communal table for dinner. Heidi and Patrick were engrossed in each other and never stopped exchanging flirtatious glances and smiles. When this continued at the bar, it seemed to Tracy that they had lost interest in the rest of the group. Heidi was in her room getting ready for the beach party when Tracy suddenly walked in. "Would you like to tell me exactly what's going on between you two?" Tracy asked, not beating around the bush. "Nothing, really," Heidi replied with some embarrassment. "It's just nice to get a little attention from the men for a change. No one dares even look at me when Keel is around. He scares the hell out of them just by his existence." "Nothing?" Tracy asked skeptically. "I don't mean to be nasty," said Heidi, "but I'm kind of glad Keel isn't here. He's so tense all the time, even when he's pretending to be cool, and it stresses me out. It's nice, for a change, to feel free and have a little fun. If he was here, I wouldn't be able to hang out with you guys in your room, and I certainly wouldn't smoke or drink more than a glass of wine. He's always so serious and careful, it's boring. For example, when we sit in a restaurant, he always sits with his back to the wall and watches the front and back entrances non-stop. He thinks I don't notice, but even when he's supposedly talking to me, he's constantly looking at other customers and even pedestrians outside the restaurant. Well, today Patrick is giving me his full attention. Patrick doesn't play the eternal game of agents and spies. It's not really a game," Tracy said sternly. "It's not just that Keel is used to acting this way. There's a danger that someone might be watching him. I know, but he's not here now. He's gone, and I'm alone. So now I have a few days to really relax. This is my first chance in 2 years to relax a little, and I'm going to make the most of it. Just be careful, okay?" "I will." Later that night, Heidi went into Tracy's room again. She could hear muffled voices coming from the beach. She wasn't surprised to find Patrick and Timmy sitting next to the coffee table, holding drinking cups and smoking pot. When they saw her, their jaws dropped. She was wearing a short black strapless dress that didn't leave much room for imagination. The 2 stoned men were literally drooling. Heidi could hear a bunch of sounds coming from the bathroom. Tracy and April were fancying themselves in there. Patrick offered Heidi a drink and a joint. When Tracy and April finally came out, Patrick and Timmy exchanged understanding looks. They felt like the happiest people on the island. There was a full moon that night, the festivities on the beach hardly needed extra lighting. By 10 p.m., many of the revelers could barely stand on their feet. The open bars were making everyone too drunk. Tracy's company felt about the same way. In addition to being drunk, they were slightly overheated. Patrick wouldn't leave Heidi's side, and Tracy didn't like the fact that Heidi was letting him hug her here and there. Timmy was desperately trying to make some moves on Tracy and April, but he was constantly being stopped. It wasn't anything personal, they did the same thing to every person who tried to make a move on them. No matter how drunk they were, both Tracy and April knew that going out with a coworker was a bad idea. Near midnight, the DJ started playing melodic techno, and the moderate, sensual beat really heated things up on the sandy dance floor. Patrick and Heidi slowly moved away from the rest of the group to the edge of the crowd. When they thought they had enough privacy, they moved closer, and she wrapped her arms around his neck. He responded by wrapping his arms around her waist and placing his hands on her lower back, dangerously close to her buttocks. In addition to the drinking, smoking and sensual dancing, there was another factor that made this evening deadly for Heidi. Her estrogen levels were at their monthly peak. She was ovulating, and therefore very horny. At some point Heidi stopped caring about Keel, Tracy, April or anyone else. All she was fixated on was letting out the held-back sexual tension that had built up inside her throughout the day and had reached truly insane levels. When Patrick pressed down with his pelvis, she felt his erection rubbing against her and shuddered so hard she was afraid she was going to come right there on the beach. She turned and pressed her back against him, letting him close his hands around her hips. He nuzzled the back of her neck with his nose, and she felt the delicious heat of friction as he pressed his whole body against her. At some point, she just couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed his arm and dragged him after her towards the shore. When she thought they were far enough away from the party, and especially from Tracy's prying eyes, she pounced on him with a wet and passionate kiss, letting her hands roam all over his body. "We won't go all the way," she thought. "We'll only give each other pleasure once and call it a day. Follow me," she whispered in Patrick's ear. She walked quickly towards the path leading to the stairs, and he followed her. She ran up the stairs without raising her eyes, deluding herself into believing that if she couldn't see the passers-by, they wouldn't see her either. After she and Patrick reached her room, panting from both the climb and the excitement, she had to hand him the magnetic card for the door. Her hands were too shaky to do it herself. Patrick did just fine. Both he and she knew what awaited them there. As soon as the door closed behind them, they started devouring each other. "Fuck, this feels good," she thought. Patrick wasn't as big and muscular as Keel, but he made up for it with his sheer enthusiasm and stamina. The admiration she saw in his eyes rubbed her ego. She dropped all pretense. They did it again and again. They tried every possible position and she stopped counting how many times she had come. The mixture of drinking, smoking, dancing and sex took its toll. Gladys collapsed on the mattress and began to fall asleep. She felt the weight of Patrick's body pressing against her back as he penetrated her from behind. She didn't care, though, she was already too far gone. The next morning Heidi woke up with a terrible hangover, and Patrick was nowhere to be seen. At first everything was like a fog, she did not realize where she was. The first coherent thought that came into her head, like a poisonous arrow piercing her temples, was, "My marriage is over." This horrible thought soon turned to panic. Guilt and shame were beyond what she could handle. "What have I done?" she berated herself. "I'm a stupid slut." She wanted to scream, but she couldn't. She pulled herself by the hair, but she didn't have the strength. She ran to the bathroom to throw up, but nothing came out. She was so thirsty that she drank rusty water straight from the tap in the sink. Then she went back to her bed and collapsed. Curled up in the sheets, she cried herself to tears. After a while a gloomy thought crossed her mind, and she ran out onto the balcony. "The slope," she thought. "This is a fucking slope. I can't even kill myself. Desperate and broken, she went back to bed and lay there for hours without moving. In every possible scenario she ran through her head, Keel would eventually find out what had happened. The only way out was to confess everything, but he probably wouldn't forgive her. Even if he did, their relationship would never be the same again. Keel wouldn't trust her anymore, and rightly so. Even she didn't trust herself. She honestly asked herself if she could forgive Keel's cheating under these circumstances, and the answer was no. At breakfast, Patrick and Timmy found out that they were no longer welcome at the girls' table. They were very disappointed, but they didn't make a scene. That afternoon Tracy and April rented a car and drove to the other side of the island to see a landmark called Pink Beach. They debated whether to invite Heidi, but decided against it. She didn't show up for breakfast and lunch, so they assumed she needed to be alone. On the way there, they picked up two young Italian traveling companions. Pink Beach was in a secluded spot, half an hour's walk from the nearest car park. The effort was worth it. The pink sand was not only pleasant to look at, but also unusually soft. On the way back, they stopped at a vegan restaurant and ordered takeaway for Heidi. They also managed to get a couple of pills for her for the morning. At first Heidi wouldn't open the door for them, but after April nearly broke the door down, Heidi relented and let them in. She looked terrible, disheveled hair, a swollen, red face that spoke of many tears, and a foul odor that suggested she hadn't showered since yesterday. Tracy and April enclosed their friend in a long group hug. It took a lot of coaxing, but Heidi finally agreed to shower and then eat something. She flatly refused to go down to the dining room with them, however. She didn't want to see the understanding looks or hear the whispers. Completely sober and unable to sleep, Heidi spent a long and agonizing night. Her mind was racing, asking hard questions and giving no answers. How would she tell Keel? How much would she tell him? How would she convince him that it was a one-time mistake and that she was willing to do anything to make amends? Finally, after all her mental torment, she came to a painful decision. She was a practical girl. If she was destined to lose her husband, there was nothing left for her to do but move on, despite all the grief she was feeling. The next day at lunch, Tracy and April were surprised to see Heidi burst into the dining room in a colorful sundress, looking gorgeous and smiling. She avoided looking at the other diners, however. Dinner went well and she even joined them for the final party on the beach that evening, but this time she avoided drinking and smoking. At 2 a.m, Heidi heard a light knock on her door. She was awake. When she opened the door, she was surprised to find Patrick standing alone with a pleading look on his face. She shook her head and closed the door. The next day Tracy, Heidi and April stood quietly in the check-in queue at the terminal for their flight home. Patrick and Timmy, standing behind them, couldn't stop talking and seemed very happy. At one point Tracy couldn't take it anymore, so she turned round, threw Patrick a sharp look and said, "You look very contented for a man whose days are numbered. You must disappear as soon as the plane lands. Keel will take his time until he tortures you to death. With his connections, he might even confess to the murder and still go free." Then she turned to Timmy. "He'll probably think you were an accomplice, Timmy. I wouldn't be surprised if he was waiting for you at the airport when we landed." Both of them turned white as a sheet. They didn't know anything specific about Keel's military background, but he was still the biggest, scariest guy they'd ever seen. Heidi called Keel and insisted that he not pick her up from the airport, since Tracy would take her home. Heidi figured that Keel would probably realize that something was wrong as soon as he saw her. She didn't want them to end up in a ditch on the side of the road. Keel was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Heidi entered the house. He dropped everything and ran to hug and kiss her. He realized something was wrong when she dodged his lips and planted her cheek instead. An hour later, they were eating dinner in complete silence. The tension in the air was unbearable. "I have bad news," Heidi said at last, her voice trembling. Keel said nothing while Heidi tearfully recounted the sequence of events. She was hiding nothing. She repeated and emphasized that it was an isolated incident, a combination of alcohol, drugs, a special day in her menstrual cycle, and that she would do anything to earn his forgiveness and a second chance. She was practically begging. When she had nothing more to say, Keel stood up and asked grimly, "You said Tracy and April were drinking and smoking with you. Did either of them end up in bed with a colleague?" "No, but—" He didn't let her finish her sentence. He rushed into the bedroom and started packing his sports bag. "No!" Heidi shouted behind him. "I'm the one who has to go." "Shut up," he hissed. When he had finished packing, he headed for the front door and found Heidi standing there, blocking his way. "Away!" he commanded. "No," she pleaded. "Please. Please stay." He put his big hand on her shoulder and pushed her easily aside. He was about to open the door when she clutched at his arm with all her might and whimpered. Her tears and pain reached him and he froze. Heidi lowered her hand as she saw his broad shoulders shake. She reached up and almost touched his shoulder, but she was afraid, so she just held her hand over his trembling body. She wanted so badly to hug him tightly and never let go, but she knew that wouldn't help. She knew that if he ever decided to come back to her, it would have to be because he wanted to, not just because of an instinctive reaction to the sound of his wife's pain. He lingered, but eventually left. Keel was on his way to the motel when he suddenly changed his mind and turned around. He needed to hear another version of Heidi's story from someone he could trust. He also didn't want to be alone. A cup of coffee was already waiting for him when Tracy let him into her flat. She confirmed all the details from Heidi's story and added some of her own, including Heidi's rejection of Patrick last night. She told him that Heidi had not stopped crying for 2 days, and that at one point she had even feared for Heidi's safety. She also begged him not to pursue Patrick because he wasn't worth the effort, and said that she doubted whether he would even show up for work on Monday. Keel sat sullenly for a long hour, staring silently at the floor. Finally he got up, went to the guest room, and locked the door behind him. Tracy didn't think this was a good time to ask him to forgive or move on. He needed time to digest what he had heard. At noon the next day, Keel had not yet left the room or answered her knock. Tracy set the tray of food by the door and told him she was going to check on Heidi. Heidi was in worse condition than she had been 2 days ago. It took Tracy a long time to convince her to eat and drink something. Fortunately, she was too weak and apathetic to resist as Tracy dragged her into the bathroom. Closing the bathroom door behind her, Tracy collapsed to the floor and burst into tears. The two people she loved most were in a terrible situation and there was really nothing she could do to help them. Keel had not yet left the guest room when Tracy returned from work the next day. She decided to cook dinner, which included all his favorite vegetarian dishes, in addition to a special baked salmon. She smiled to herself with pleasure as she heard his bedroom door open and then the bathroom door close. He looked almost as normal when he sat down at the dinner table. He was even smiling and talking more than usual. After dinner, they sat in the living room with a bottle of wine. "What are you going to do?" Tracy asked. "I'm going to get a divorce." "Isn't that a bit hasty?" "The first chance she got, she cheated on me. If you hadn't got her those pills, she'd be carrying a bastard in her womb right now. She made a terrible mistake, but she's only human. She won't make that mistake again." "Hell, she sure as hell wouldn't. Once a cheater, always a cheater." "You actually believe that cliché?" "Yeah. Definitely. She'd never drink or smoke without you. I doubt she'd go anywhere without you except work. It doesn't have to happen again under the same circumstances. It just has to be the right situation." Tracy tilted her head and looked at him questioningly, but he just looked at her meaningfully and smiled. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she said, "not a third, but just a second. Heidi deserves another chance. I'll throw her to the wolves myself if she slips up again. I have known her for 10 years. She is a good person, and she loves you very much. Even good people cheat and do bad things. They don't deserve special treatment. I really think you're wrong about that, not just about all of us humans, but especially about Heidi. We can all make critical mistakes when circumstances are right, or wrong, I suppose. Why haven't you and April made a mistake? You're not even married. Well, not being married, we couldn't have made that particular mistake. Although we certainly had fun. But not with colleagues, and I bet you used defense. Always bet on Tracy, you can't miss, she said mischievously. I'll tell you what, she said after a pause, give her another chance, at least for a week. If after that week you decide you can't go on, I understand, but at least try, for both of you, and also for me. I love you both so much, I'll agree to do anything to keep you two together. What? Anything. I have an idea, but I don't think you'll like it. You want to bet? Heidi stood in the kitchen cutting vegetables for dinner. Tracy had already told her that Keel had decided to give her another chance and would be coming home that evening. When she heard the front door open, she gingerly turned around. At first Keel stood at the entrance looking tense, but as soon as he smiled at her, she dropped everything, ran up to him, jumped on top of him, wrapped her legs around his waist and covered his entire face with kisses. He tried to avoid it like one avoids licking a loving puppy. He just patted her back affectionately. Dinner was pleasant, and Heidi felt no displeasure from it. For the first time in a week, she was happy and hopeful. That night, in bed, he politely rejected her advances. It's too soon for me, he explained, and she understood. She wasn't fooling herself into believing that everything would be back to normal in a moment. She had all the patience in the world because there was hope. In the days that followed, they went out to dinner and shopping, cuddled on the sofa in front of the TV every night and even kissed lightly. Things were looking promising. On Friday night, however, Keel dropped a bombshell. They were sitting, snuggled up against each other, on the sofa in front of the TV when Keel suddenly said, I've got some bad news. Heidi flinched, then looked at him apprehensively. When Tracy convinced me to give you another chance, he said in a cold voice, not taking his eyes off the television screen, it was on the condition that you feel my pain. Heidi tilted her head to the side in confusion. The only way for us to move on is if I get even. What? What? Heidi stuttered. I'm going to spend the weekend with Tracy. If you can get over it, then when I come back, maybe we can really start over. She would never dare hurt me like that. She wouldn't dare, that was my only condition, and she had already agreed. I'll leave tomorrow night and be back Sunday night. And then we can continue. No. Please don't. This is crazy. She's my best friend. Please don't do this to me. Keel got up and went to the master bedroom, leaving Heidi sobbing on the couch. Eventually she managed to fall asleep, thinking it was just a cruel experiment. They just want to test me, she convinced herself. This is just some kind of sneaky revenge. Nothing will really happen between them. The next evening, Heidi stood in her bedroom and watched her husband pack his gym bag. Don't. She whispered one last time before he left the house. She ran over to the living room window and watched him get into his car and drive away. Part of her still believed it was just an evil joke. When she saw him pull away, she grabbed her keys and ran to her car. Keel had just entered the lobby of Tracy's house when Heidi pulled up. She parked next to the pavement in front of the building and looked up at the windows of Tracy's flat. She saw the dim light in the living room grow brighter. She saw the shadows of figures flickering on the walls. After about 20 minutes, the light in the living room went out and the light in Tracy's bedroom came on. Another minute, and the whole flat was in total darkness. Heidi thought she saw the curtains in the dark bedroom move, but she wasn't sure. No one heard Heidi's painful scream. She returned home in agony, tears streaming down her face. At first she tried to convince herself that this was the price she had to pay for her infidelity, and tried to think of something else to just pass the time. It was to no avail. Her thoughts went back to her husband and best friend. She imagined them pleasuring each other in bed, Tracy's cries of ecstasy and her husband's adoring face as he looked down at Tracy's happy face, smiling up at him contentedly. She imagined that Keel was getting much more pleasure from her friend than from her. At some point, her envy and self-torture turned to pure madness. She fantasized about taking a kitchen knife, running to Tracy's flat and stabbing her when she opened the door. She even thought about taking one of the guns in Keel's safe and shooting them both in the head, but she knew he'd taken the key to the safe with him. He always did. "Yeah, I fucked up big once," she said aloud, her voice drenched in disgust. "But not with my fucking best friend, who also happened to be an ex." She called Keel on his mobile, but he didn't answer. Then she called Tracy, but all calls went to voicemail. She even called April, but there was no answer. Heidi was too out of breath to realize how late it was at night. Each failed call was a painful blow, another part of the conspiracy against her. Finally, in utter despair, she rang Patrick. He arrived quite quickly and behaved like a real gentleman. He listened patiently to her desperate cries and explanations, handing her a glass of water. When she was nestled in his lap, shivering, he patted her shoulder gently. When she calmed down a bit, he kissed her soothingly on the top of her head, assuring her that everything would be okay. When he saw that the first kiss had helped, he kissed her cheek. He certainly didn't resist when she suddenly kissed him passionately. In the bedroom, they repeated all their exercises from their last night together, but this time it was even more exciting and pleasurable. For Heidi, it was revenge sex, and there was nothing hotter. Only after he had entered her for the third time did they both collapse on the sheets and fall into a deep, sweet sleep. After a while, Heidi woke up from her deep slumber because the bedroom light was on. Why does that idiot have to switch on the light when he goes to pee? She turned around in bed and felt a hand touch someone's body. If he's in bed, who turned on the light? She thought in horror. She propped herself up on her elbows and squinted painfully at what appeared to be two figures. After a few agonizing seconds, her sleepy eyes finally managed to adjust to the light. She saw Keel and Tracy standing at the foot of the bed, staring at her naked body. Tracy looked furious. Keel looked down at Heidi with pity and disgust, like he was watching a gazelle being torn apart by a hyena. "You owe me $500, he said to Tracy. "Yeah, I know," Tracy replied coldly. "You were right. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes." Thanks for watching. And don't forget to rate the video and leave your comment.